My daughter-in-law burst out laughing, right in front of my wife, just because she saw her hands. We were sitting in a luxury revolving restaurant in New York. Crystal glasses caught the light like diamonds. Everything looked polished, expensive, untouchable. Willow lifted her Hermes bag high in the air and said, "My wife's hands were too dirty to touch crocodile leather." Then she turned to her friends, laughing louder, when my own son joked that his mother had been touching dirty things her whole life. If this story touches something in your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know how many people out there understand what it feels like to watch your wife be humiliated in the middle of a crowded dinner party, and to understand why that morning I chose silence instead of fighting back. I have to go back to things that seemed small at the time, but quietly changed everything. I stood there, silent. They had no idea those hands had once saved the most powerful man in that room. I stood there, silent, not because I didn't hear what they said, but because at 70 years old, I've learned something. There are moments when, if you speak too soon, the truth loses its weight. The restaurant turned slowly high above the city. Wide glass panels opened to the Manhattan skyline, glowing at dusk. Soft classical music floated in the background. Servers moved carefully as if afraid to scratch the marble floor. Everything was arranged for a perfect evening. Willow's 30th birthday, and my wife, Jill, stood there like a detail that didn't belong in the painting. She wore a cream linen blouse, pressed flat since morning. She liked that fabric because it breathes, as she always said. I knew she had hesitated before choosing it. I also knew she never cared for designer dresses the way Willow and her friends wore them, like armor. Jill's hands were folded in front of her, large knuckles, thickened skin, a few pale scars faded by time. I had held those hands on freezing nights in Montana, when the forge still burned red and the wind slipped through the cracks in the wooden door. I knew every vein on them. Willow did not. She stood among a group of young women in fitted evening gowns, hair styled perfectly. In her hand was a deep wine-colored Hermes bag. She lifted it like a treasure, her voice just loud enough for the whole table to hear. "It's real crocodile leather," she said. "One small scratch, and the value drops." A few impressed murmurs followed. My son Wyatt stood beside his wife with a proud smile. He wore a tailored suit, his tie tied just right. I looked at him and remembered the barefoot boy who used to run across the red dirt behind my forge. Jill stepped a little closer. Not out of curiosity. That's just who she is. She likes to understand what others treasure. She reached out, barely touching the edge of the bag. Willow pulled it back sharply, so fast that the red wine in her glass nearly spilled over. She looked at Jill's hand as if it might ruin her evening. "Look at these hands," Willow said, half laughing. "They're rough enough to scratch my crocodile leather." A few laughs broke out. I heard them clearly. Wyatt did not stay quiet. "She's right," he said lightly. "Mom spent her whole life touching dirty things back home." I didn't look at my son. I looked at Jill. She didn't pull her hand away. She simply lowered it, folding it again like before. Her face stayed calm. So calm, it tightened my throat. Willow heard the word dirty and laughed harder. I imagined she pictured barns, mud chores she had never done in her life. Then it happened. She leaned back from laughing too hard. The red wine tipped forward. A splash stained Jill's cream blouse, and a few drops touched her cheek. The whole room went quiet, just for a moment. Then scattered laughter rose from Willow's friends. Not loud, but loud enough. Jill lifted her hand and wiped her face. Not rushed, not angry. She accepted the napkin Wyatt handed her, casually as if it were nothing more than a small accident. "I'm sorry," Willow said. But there was no regret in her voice. I laughed too hard. I heard the shift. She didn't say "Mom," she said "I." A distance placed right there at the table. I stepped closer to Jill. Not to shield her, just to stand beside her. Some things don't need words. I looked around. Expensive suits, shining watches, curious eyes waiting to see how we would react. They were watching the old man from Montana, waiting to see what he would do when his wife was embarrassed in a place like this. I did nothing. I placed my hand gently on Jill's back. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm fine," she said. Short, steady. I knew she was holding her voice still, not from shame, from disappointment. Wyatt looked at us like we were guests who had wandered into the wrong room. I recognized that look, the look of someone afraid to be reminded where he came from. "Maybe you two should sit over there," he said quietly. "It's a little crowded here." I nodded. No argument. We walked toward the edge of the revolving floor, where the lights were dimmer. I could feel the slow turning of the building beneath my feet. The city sparkled outside, unconcerned with the small cruelties inside this room. Jill looked down at the spreading red stain on her blouse, dark against the pale fabric. "Shame about the shirt," she said softly. I didn't answer. I looked at her hands again, still folded, still steady. Willow thought those were the hands of someone who had only done lowly work. Wyatt had let her believe that. The whole room had laughed. I wondered, if they knew what those hands had once done, would they still be laughing? I've lived long enough to understand this. Some truths don't need to be rushed into the light. They find their own moment. And that night, in that quiet, revolving restaurant above New York, I knew that moment was getting close. I've lived long enough to understand this. Some truths don't need to be rushed into the light. They find their own time. I looked at Jill's hands again. Under the soft golden lights, they didn't tremble. The skin was thick. The small scars rested there quietly, like lines of a language no one in that room knew how to read. People often think rough hands mean dirt, barns, hard labor. I've heard that plenty of times back in Montana. But they never saw Jill inside a field tent in the desert, when hot winds slammed against the canvas like it wanted to tear the world open. I'm not telling you this to make anyone feel guilty. I'm saying it because before Willow had her collection of handbags, before Wyatt learned how to shake hands with men whose titles were longer than their names, Jill had another world, a world without marble floors. Years ago, when I worked at the forge every day, Jill wasn't beside me. She belonged to a special military medical unit. I never pushed for details. Not because I wasn't curious, but because some things have to be offered freely. I only knew this when the phone rang in the middle of the night. She dressed in silence. A helicopter would meet her at the small airfield near town, and she would be gone for weeks, sometimes months. Later, after she retired, when we had more evenings sitting side by side, I began to understand. Those hands worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, not on crocodile leather, but on the bodies of young men and women barely out of school, people who needed one more chance to go home. The calluses didn't come from holding a shovel. They came from holding surgical instruments too long, under unbearable pressure. The thin scar near her wrist, that came from a surprise attack on a field unit while she was in the middle of an operation. She never told the full story. She just said there wasn't time to be afraid. Jill never hung her medals on the wall. They sit in a small wooden box at the back of the closet, along with a few faded photographs. In those pictures, she wears simple medical gear, her hair tied back, her eyes focused in a way that almost makes her look like someone else. Sterner, more decisive than the woman standing beside me tonight. When she chose to retire, it wasn't from exhaustion. She said she had done enough. She wanted to hear my hammer strike the anvil in the morning, plant a few rows of vegetables, watch snow settle on the roof of our wooden house. For her, peace was an escape. It was a decision. Wyatt knows all of this. He grew up with his mother, leaving for important work. He used to wait on the porch when the helicopter landed. He used to hold her tight when she came home with dark circles under her eyes. But when he left Montana for New York, that story was tucked away, like a past that didn't quite match his new suit. I understand change. Big cities have a way of making people want to reinvent themselves. I just didn't expect the price of reinvention, to be looking down on where you came from. As Jill quietly blotted the wine from her blouse, I remembered a night many years ago. We were sitting on the porch. Her hands rested on her knees. I asked her what she was most proud of in her career. She thought for a long time. Then she said, "When someone comes back years later and tells me they're still here. Not a title, not praise, just the continued existence of another human being." That's why Jill never talks about her past. To her, saving someone isn't a story for a dinner party. It's a responsibility. I looked around the restaurant again. The laughter had faded, but the curious eyes remained. They measured Jill by her fabric, by shoes that weren't limited edition, by the way she stood just a little straighter than the rest. They didn't know she had stood that straight in far harsher places. Willow had already turned back to her friends, talking about a European getaway. Wyatt leaned in as if nothing had happened. I could see the effort in him, holding the perfect picture together, but the cracks were already there. Jill said nothing. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. She simply stood there, calm, like someone who has seen too much to be wounded by careless words. I wondered if this room knew that the hands they laughed at were once flown in by helicopter for the hardest cases. If they knew grown men had wept when they saw her again. If they knew certain names in government today owed her a second chance at life. Would they still look at her the same way? I didn't rush to answer that. The night was still young, and there was a special guest Willow had spent a great deal of money to invite. I heard the restaurant manager whisper something to a staff member. The air in the room shifted slightly, like wind changing direction before a storm. Jill stood beside me, the wine now dried into a dark stain on her blouse. She didn't try to hide it. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Some truths don't need to be shouted to be heard. Sometimes it only takes one person to recognize them. I had just finished that thought when the main doors of the restaurant opened, not loudly, but enough for the entire room to shift just a little. The servers straightened their backs. The music kept playing, yet the conversations dropped a few tones softer. The special guest had arrived. Willow nearly sprang from her spot. I watched her adjust her hair, smooth the side of her dress signal for Wyatt to step forward. The two of them moved quickly toward the entrance, leaving us at the edge of the revolving floor. "He's here," Wyatt whispered, a spark of excitement in his voice. I hadn't heard in a long time. Not when he spoke to his parents. I didn't need to ask who he was. All week, Willow had talked about this night like it was a milestone. She spoke of opportunity, of connections, of how the presence of the governor of New York would elevate the party to another level. Tonight wasn't just a birthday. It was a performance. At the doorway, security stepped in first. Then came a middle-aged man, posture straight eyes, observant but unhurried. He shook Willow's hand, then Wyatt's. Phones immediately lifted from every direction. Willow beamed, leaning slightly forward as she spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew she was trying to impress him. Wyatt stood beside her, confident but tight around the edges. He wanted everything flawless. I noticed Jill had taken another small step back, giving the moment space. She had no intention of entering that circle. A server approached us quietly. "Sir, ma'am," he said softly, "the center area is reserved for the honored guest. If you wouldn't mind standing closer to the other side." His tone was polite. The message underneath was clear. Jill nodded. She always nods at small things. We moved nearer to the service counter, where the lights were dimmer. From there I could feel the slow turning of the floor more clearly, like a steady breath beneath our feet. Willow glanced around, scanning the room's arrangement. When she spotted us at the edge, she walked over, her smile still in place, though her voice lowered. "Doctor." She paused, as if the word didn't quite fit the image in her mind. "Mom should probably stand here instead. Your outfit blends better near the service area." She said it as though she were offering something reasonable. Wyatt didn't object. He simply nodded and handed Jill another napkin. "To clean up more," he said, avoiding her eyes. I felt something open inside my chest. Not anger flaring, just a quiet emptiness. Jill accepted the napkin. "Thank you, son," she said. The same steady voice. Willow had already turned away, slipping back into the central circle where the governor was speaking with a few business leaders. Laughter and the soft clink of glasses floated through the air. I understood what Willow feared. She feared an imperfect detail slipping into the frame. She feared Wyatt's past standing too clearly under these highlights. She wanted everything arranged like a perfect photograph. Lights, guests, toasts, carefully calculated relationships. But life doesn't always hold still for pictures. I noticed the governor beginning to move away from the center. Not hurried, but his gaze did not remain fixed on Willow. He surveyed the entire room like a man used to reading small details. Then he paused. Just slightly. His eyes settled in our direction. I couldn't tell who he was looking at. Perhaps the dark wine stain on Jill's blouse. Perhaps the way she stood straight, hands folded, not bowing her head despite what had just happened. Willow was still speaking behind him, trying to hold his attention, but I could see it shift. Wyatt saw it too. He glanced quickly toward us, then back at the governor, as if calculating whether to introduce his parents. He didn't. I didn't judge him in that moment. I simply remembered. Jill remained still. She didn't look at the governor. She looked out the glass windows where the city stretched beneath the lights. Maybe she was thinking of something else. Maybe she was just waiting for the evening to end. I leaned closer. "You want to leave?" She shook her head. "It's all right." I knew that answer wasn't only for my question. At the center, an MC stepped forward with a microphone preparing to offer a birthday toast. Willow took Wyatt's hand, standing close beside the governor. Phones lifted again. Everything had been arranged for a memorable moment. But some memorable moments aren't part of the script. The governor didn't focus on the microphone. He turned his head once more, toward us. This time, his gaze didn't just pass by. It stayed. I felt Jill's hand gently tighten around mine. Not from fear, but because she sensed it too. Something shifting. The room kept turning slowly. The music continued. But the axis of the evening had begun to tilt away from where Willow intended it to be. And I knew, one more step, and the silence that had held its shape all evening would no longer remain the same. That step came sooner than I expected. The governor didn't wait for the MC to finish the welcome. He set his glass down gently, said something brief to Willow, then turned, not toward the small stage, toward us. I saw Willow freeze. The smile stayed on her lips, but her eyes flickered with confusion. Wyatt noticed the shift too. He took a step as if he could redirect the path of attention. Too late. The governor walked straight past the guests, past tailored suits and evening gowns. His security hesitated, then followed. The room quieted. Even the sound of silverware against plates softened. He stopped in front of Jill. Up close, I could see his eyes clearly. Not polite, not political. This wasn't a man looking for a photograph. It was a man trying to confirm what he had just realized. He glanced at the dried wine stain on her blouse, then up at her face. "Excuse me," he said slowly. "Are you... Jill?" The room fell completely still. Jill was surprised. I felt the slight change in her breathing. "Yes," she said. "I'm Jill." He drew in a long breath. Then in front of everyone, he stepped closer and took both her hands. Not dramatic, not for show. Just a firm, steady grip. "I've been trying to find you for years," he said, his voice lower now. "I wasn't sure you would remember me." I looked around. Willow stood a few steps away, her fingers tight around her wine glass. Wyatt beside her, his face a shade paler. Jill did not pull her hands away. "I've met many people," she said gently. "Help me remember." He nodded, accepting that he was only one of many who had once stood before her in need. "Years ago," he said, "I was far from home. There was a situation. I was taken to a temporary medical unit. The other doctors said the odds were slim." He paused. No one in the room dared interrupt. "You were there," he continued. "You didn't leave the room until everything was stable. I remember your hands, calm, precise. Not a second of hesitation." Jill studied him closely. Then I saw something shift in her eyes. "Fallujah," she said quietly. He nodded. Yes. No more details were needed. No harsh memories spoken aloud. The two of them understood enough. Whispers began behind us. Guests were looking at Jill differently now. Not curious. Careful. The governor still held her hands. "If it weren't for you," he said, "I wouldn't be standing here today. I often wondered what happened to the woman who stayed that night. I never expected to see you again. Like this." His gaze flicked to the wine stain. He didn't need an explanation. Willow stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Governor," she said quickly, "what an incredible coincidence. My mother-in-law, she doesn't usually talk about her past." Her voice tried to stay smooth. I heard the strain underneath. The governor turned to her. His eyes were not harsh, but firm enough to cool the room. "That past," he said, "slowly gave many people the chance to keep living." He faced Jill again. "I often tell my staff there are heroes who never stand on a stage. They choose silence and go home. Tonight I understand why." No one laughed anymore. Wyatt stepped forward. "Sir, my mom, she's been retired for a long time." "That doesn't diminish what she did," the governor replied. He released her hands but remained close. The respect in his posture was unmistakable. "It's an honor to see you again," he said. "New York owes you its thanks. Not a speech, just a simple truth. The MC stood frozen with the microphone, unsure whether to continue the script. After a moment, he lowered it. Willow was no longer smiling. She looked at Jill as if a stranger had stepped into a story she thought she controlled. I looked at my son. Something had cracked open in his expression. Not loud shame, but a slow understanding. Jill remained calm. "You've done well since then," she said. "I've followed the news." That was how she ended it. No claim to credit. No mention of sacrifice. Just a quiet acknowledgement. But in that room, it changed everything. The axis of the party no longer rested on the birthday cake or carefully arranged connections. It rested on the hands that had once been called dirty, and I stood beside my wife without needing to say another word. The truth walked into the room on its own. And this time, no one laughed. I could feel the air change. The eyes that once measured Jill now carried caution. A few guests stepped closer, as if they needed to confirm what they had just heard, but no one dared step between her and the governor. Willow stood still. I had never seen her that quiet. The polished smile she practiced so well was gone. She didn't know what to say in a moment that wasn't part of her plan. Wyatt looked at his mother longer than before, not with avoidance, but with the look of someone remembering something he once knew and tried to forget. The governor asked to say a few words to the room. The MC handed him the microphone. No music this time. "I was invited here to celebrate a new milestone," he said calmly. "But sometimes on nights like this, we are reminded of older values, stronger ones." He didn't speak of battlefields or emergencies. He spoke about dedication, responsibility, about people who choose silence over recognition. I believe he finished a strong society is not measured by what it displays, but by those who quietly hold it together. He turned to Jill and gave a small nod. The room applauded, not loud like a birthday cheer, but steady, long enough to matter. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at my wife. Jill didn't change her expression. She didn't bow her head. She simply said, "Thank you for remembering." The governor left shortly after. He shook Wyatt's hand, congratulated Willow, then departed with his staff. But when he walked out those doors, I knew the night no longer belonged to its original script. The guests spoke differently now. A few approached Jill with more careful voices. Willow tried to revive the mood, but the sparkle had faded. I turned to Wyatt. "Your mom and I are heading out," I said. He opened his mouth as if to stop us, then only nodded. Before we turned away, Jill looked at her son. "You don't have to be ashamed of where you come from," she said slowly. "But if you're ashamed of your parents, I can't help you anymore." There was no anger in her voice, just a truth set down gently. Wyatt didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands. Soft, clean, no calluses. He swallowed and said quietly, I was wrong." Jill didn't respond to the apology. She only nodded, as if that sentence would need time to prove itself. We stepped out while the floor behind us kept turning. The city still glittered, but I felt lighter than when we arrived. In the elevator, Jill gave a small laugh. "Poor shirt," she said again. "I can wash it," I replied. She shook her head. "It's not about the wine." I understood. A year after that night, our lives didn't change much. I still stand at the forge each morning. Jill still tends her garden behind the house. But something new began. She used most of her savings to start a small fund for veterans who need long-term medical care. No announcements. No grand opening. Just quiet support reaching the right people. When I asked why, she said, "If we can still help, we should." Willow doesn't appear in society magazines the way she once did. I don't pay much attention. Reputation spins faster than that restaurant ever did. Wyatt is different. A few months after the party, he came back to Montana. No expensive suit. No big talk about projects. He asked to stay for a while. I didn't ask many questions. I handed him a pair of thick gloves and said, "Hold steady." The first days, his hands blistered. He wasn't used to the hammer, not the heat of metal. But he didn't quit. One afternoon, as we stood by the forge, he said, "I thought success meant standing in the center. But maybe some of the most important people stand at the edge." I didn't answer. I just kept striking the anvil. Jill stood on the porch, watching us. The weight in her eyes from that night in New York was gone. She hasn't said she's fully forgiven him. And I think that's fair. Respect doesn't grow from an apology. It grows from how a person lives afterward. Someone once asked me if I felt satisfied when the truth came out in that elegant dining room. I didn't. I only felt relieved, because the hands that were mocked were finally seen for what they were worth, not for revenge, but as a reminder that dignity doesn't depend on lighting or labels. It lives in what we do when no one is watching. And sometimes, if even one person recognizes that, it's enough. If this story made you think, subscribe to the channel, tap like, and share it so others can hear what we sometimes forget in a noisy world. A person's value isn't found in appearance or position in a room. It's found in the quiet work done when no one applauds. Don't judge someone by the dust on their shirt. Some rough hands are the reason this world is still standing. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'll see you in the next story.